I'm Kendra Wilkerson, and I focus on program planning and development and RIA's viability initiatives. But in this presentation, I will be delving into federal procurement requirements. Section 3 of our project management procedures is dedicated to this topic. I won't cover every detail of that section in this presentation, but I want to highlight some of the big picture requirements. First, I'd like to clarify which types of purchases these federal requirements apply to. Your organization will probably have multiple contracts or purchases over the course of your SCIIP project. Materials purchases, engineering and construction contracts, legal fees, etc. If you're funding an entire purchase or contract with funds that aren't coming from RIA, even if they are being counted as local match for the grant, then we won't be monitoring those procurement methods, and none of the requirements I'm about to cover apply to those contracts or purchases fully funded by non-SCIIP, non-RIA funds. Of course, you still have to follow all your local procurement regulations or any requirements of other funding sources you might have. But if you're using even a single dollar of funds from a SCIIP grant or a state matching grant if you received one to cover a purchase of goods or services, you'll need to comply with federal policies. Now, ideally, all grantees would have local procurement procedures that are in line with the federal standards, including the written standard of conduct covering conflicts of interest that's discussed in the federal requirements section. However, in many cases, local procurement codes aren't quite as stringent as the federal regs, or they don't specifically cover all of the required pieces. If that's the case, you can document that you will follow the written federal requirements for all SCIIP-funded contracts. Any documentation like that should be kept in the grant file for reference later. These are some of the fundamentals of federal procurement. Some of them are basic steps to avoid wasting public funds, which is probably already something your organization keeps in mind. For example, you must perform a cost or price analysis in connection with every formal procurement action, that is, all but the smallest purchases. In a construction project, this analysis would take the form of a certified bid tabulation and the engineer's determination that prices are fair and reasonable, documented in the recommendation to award. And of course, you should take steps to ensure that you aren't procuring unnecessary or duplicative goods and services. Other requirements are intended to ensure a level playing field for all potential contractors. This includes having an accurate scope of work and clearly explaining all the requirements that a bidder must fulfill when preparing their bid. And you must have clear procedures for fairly handling any protests or disputes. Lastly, you should make good faith efforts to ensure that disadvantaged business enterprises, such as minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, have the maximum opportunity to participate in SCIIP-funded contracts. In fact, when feasible, federal procurement calls for grantees to take affirmative steps to utilize DBEs, which is the federal term for these disadvantaged businesses. These affirmative steps could include keeping updated lists of qualified DBEs that you contact directly with procurement opportunities, dividing work requirements into smaller tasks or quantities when possible, and requiring prime contractors to make their own efforts when seeking subcontractors. Both SCDOT and South Carolina's Division of Small and Minority Business Contracting and Certification maintain large online lists of disadvantaged or minority-owned businesses. You can search these lists for relevant contractors that you may want to include in your direct solicitations. The main intent of federal procurement is to allow for maximum open and free competition. So you should design all grant-funded procurements with an eye toward eliminating restrictions on competition whenever possible. Some of these prohibited practices might be common practice under your local regulations, so you will need to adapt those familiar procedures a little bit for SCIIP-funded projects. For example, even if your utility would really prefer to continue to use a specific brand of fire hydrants, you do have to allow substitutions of equal products at the engineer's discretion. And instead of requiring attendance at a pre-bid conference, you can strongly encourage it, then post a record of the discussion at the conference as an addendum to the solicitation. I should mention that mandatory pre-bid conferences may be allowed for particularly complicated projects, but you would have to submit for consideration in advance a written request with an explanation of the circumstances. Those of you planning to use grant funds for engineering or legal fees may have noticed the last bullet about consultants on retainer. You should know that an indefinite delivery or on-call engineering contract may be acceptable as long as you can document that it was procured using competitive RFQ or RFP procedures that met federal requirements. These contracts typically require the issuance of a work order for specific projects. If grant funds are being used for these projects, some federal contract provisions would need to be incorporated into the work order, and RIA would need to review both the original procurement and the work order to ensure compliance with federal standards. These are some other things to look out for. Conflicts of interest should be avoided whenever possible. In the event of a possible conflict, the grantee should contact RIA to disclose and explain any potential conflict. Geographical preferences are often prohibited except when procuring engineering services. We know that many local procurement codes encourage scoring preferences for local contractors, but that would not be allowed when procuring any services other than engineering. Federal and state laws both prohibit contracts being awarded to debarred contractors, and you will be required to check this on the sam.gov site. And in general, you should be able to provide a sound rationale for any action taken during the procurement process. There are a number of federal terms and conditions that must be included in grant-funded contracts. The exact language that you will need to use is included in Section 4M of the Project Management Procedures. The first three listed up there are required in all grant-funded contracts, regardless of size. Termination for cause and convenience states that the grantee can terminate the contract for several reasons, including if the contract is no longer consistent with program goals. This section should cover both partial and whole project terminations. The Equal Opportunity Clause prohibits discrimination on the part of the contractor. The debarment and suspension provision requires the contractor to certify that it isn't precluded from federal contracting. The next two will apply to all but the smallest contracts. The Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act provision governs wages and working conditions for mechanics or laborers. The Administrative, Contractual, and Legal Remedies Clause lays out specific steps that RIA or the grantee may take in response to contractor failures. And finally, the Davis-Bacon requirement in the shaded section at the bottom will apply to very few SCIIP projects. If you're using local ARPA funds in conjunction with a SCIIP grant, and the combined total is over $10 million, or if you're using any other type of federal funds, you should check into whether this requirement applies. Several of these provisions are reviewed in more detail in the Federal Requirements section. Solicitation documents for all grant-funded contracts must also indicate how protests will be handled, and the contract should outline how disputes will be handled during the contract period. This requirement should be familiar to those of you who have received RIA state grants in the past. Any disputes arising during the project are the responsibility of the grantee and should be resolved in a timely manner in accordance with all relevant procedures. If a protest or dispute does arise, you should be sure to document all actions and keep your RIA grant manager informed throughout the process. Now let's get into the methods of procurement. There are 5 that I will talk about today, each of which is appropriate for specific types of purchases. For purchases under $250,000, you can use an informal method of procurement. Generally, you'll need to obtain price quotes from different companies. We would recommend getting written quotes so they are well documented. If the purchase is less than $10,000, you don't have to obtain quotes as long as you determine the price is reasonable based on research or experience. These procedures are generally used to purchase equipment, supplies, or materials. And of course, it's not okay to intentionally break up purchases simply to drop under this threshold and circumvent formal procurement requirements. Please contact RIA in advance if you plan to use grant funds for any small purchases. The next 3 methods are the ones you'll use the most during SCIIP projects, and I will go into more detail about the procedures for each in a minute. But first I wanted to talk about when to use each one. Engineering services should be solicited using a request for qualifications, in which cost is not a factor. Please note that an RFQ alone is acceptable only for engineering or architectural services. For any other professional services, such as legal counsel or planning studies that aren't strictly engineering, you must use a request for proposals. These proposals are evaluated on a combination of qualifications and other factors such as project approach and cost. These other factors are essential to identifying the best provider and offering a fair opportunity to all respondents. An RFP must be used for any professional services besides engineering or architectural that exceed the $250,000 threshold. It's fine to use a two-step process where you issue an RFQ to identify firms that will be invited to submit a proposal if you would like. The preferred method of procuring construction services is competitive sealed bids. This is probably the process you're familiar with for all your large construction projects. You must also use this process for any large materials purchases that are grant funded. Non-competitive or sole source procurement is only allowed in very limited circumstances, and you should always contact RIA in advance before using this method for a grant-funded purchase. Some examples where we might approve this are when you need to contract with the local electric utility for services that only they can provide, or if you need to purchase a specific brand of replacement water meters that are compatible with your existing meter reading system. You must document the reasons and demonstrate that you have no other viable options. Although non-competitive procurement may be allowed in emergency cases where delays have to be avoided, be aware that needing to move quickly in order to meet the December 2026 federal expenditure deadline is not sufficient justification for use of this method. Now let's get into a little more detail on the requirements of RFQs, RFPs, and sealed bidding. Remember that a request for qualifications is used for engineering services and may be used as a precursor to a request for proposals, which is used for other professional services such as planning studies, and is also used for alternative delivery methods such as construction manager at risk and design build. The steps for RFQs and RFPs are very similar. In fact, so similar that it's not hard to get them confused. There are some very important differences, but let's talk about the similarities first. Both processes follow these general steps. First, you have to develop the scope and the selection factors, at which point you may need to submit your draft documents for RIA review if required by a special condition on your grant. Then you advertise your request. Responses are reviewed and ranked by a committee that you select, and then you can negotiate a contract with the top respondent. Before that contract is executed, you have to submit it to RIA for review. Please see the section on contracts and change order reviews for more information on that. If you're going to do an RFQ that is followed by an RFP, you would do steps 1 through 4 for the RFQ, then start over at 1 for the RFP. The only difference would be that you wouldn't publicly advertise the RFP because only the top-ranked firms from the RFQ process would be invited to submit proposals. Let's go into a little more detail on each step. Both types of requests have to include a description of the scope of work that will be performed. However, the scope in an RFQ can be pretty general. In an RFP, it should be detailed, comprehensive, and include specific tasks and a timeline. A common special condition on SCIIP grants is to have any grant-funded RFP or RFQ reviewed prior to advertising it. The scope is one thing we look at very carefully if we do that type of preliminary review. Even if your grant does not have a special condition requiring you to submit an RFP prior to advertisement, your grant manager will be happy to discuss the scope or any other questions you have when developing it. In both an RFQ and an RFP, you must provide a specific list of the selection criteria and indicate their relative importance. The best way to do that is to include the points or percentages the committee will use for each item when scoring. Not only will this keep you in compliance with federal procurement requirements, it will also encourage more responsive proposals. You do have significant discretion over the selection criteria you use, but you do have to consider the respondent's qualifications. The other factors listed here are common ones you usually see. Remember that cost is a required factor in requests for proposals. However, it doesn't have to be the most important thing. You can choose how many points to assign to it. Advertisement is pretty straightforward. We would like you to use the South Carolina Business Opportunities website, which we know as SCIIP-o, and you should also send the solicitation directly to firms you think may be qualified, including disadvantaged business enterprises, if that is one of the affirmative steps you're taking. You should keep a record of these direct solicitations with all your other procurement documentation. After advertising, a committee of an odd number of qualified people that you pick, usually staff or others knowledgeable about the project, reviews the submissions and ranks them based on the selection criteria that were published. Interviews may be conducted to help the committee finalize the rankings, and the procedures for selecting respondents for interviews should be clearly outlined in the solicitation. The grantee must document the review and selection process. When ranking is complete, all proposers should be informed and any protest should be handled based on established procedures. You then negotiate a contract with the top firm or continue down the list if you can't come to an agreement. Once a contract is negotiated and both parties have agreed to the language, but before it's executed, you submit it to us for review. As I mentioned earlier, if you already have an on-call contract with an engineering firm that you selected through an RFQ process that meets the requirements I just outlined, you may be able to use that firm for grant-funded work without conducting a separate procurement. However, you should discuss this with your grant manager before proceeding, and you'll be required to submit documentation of how that on-call contract was originally procured, as well as the work order for this specific project. I know that many of you use the services of an engineering firm in conducting preliminary planning for your SCIIP project, or maybe even in preparing your application. Some federally funded programs bar those firms from bidding on the final design contract. That is not the case with SCIIP. However, you do need to follow some very important special procedures in order for a firm that was involved in preliminary planning to be eligible to bid on a grant-funded final design contract. You must post all relevant preliminary engineering information online for public access at the time of the RFQ. This would include the entire SCIIP application as well as any PERs or other documents that were prepared. Now, you may have heard that the Municipal Association of South Carolina issued an RFQ to create a list of qualified engineering firms for use on projects funded by local ARPA dollars. We did check into whether this list could be used for SCIIP-funded projects, but unfortunately the answer is no, due to laws about piggybacking on other entities' procurements. So if SCIIP or RIA dollars will be used on an engineering contract, you need to procure that contract on your own. Finally, I know you may be wondering if we have an RFQ or RFP template that you can start from. And we do. These templates are on our website to assist you, but you don't have to use that exact formatting and wording. If you have your own format that meets the SCIIP requirements, that's just fine. Whether you use the template or not, RIA will have to review all of your procurement documents for SCIIP-funded contracts. Now, let's talk about a special case when you may need to use an RFP. Most grantees will utilize the traditional design, bid, build, delivery method for procurement of construction contracts. We'll take a look at the bid process for those in a minute. Alternative delivery methods such as design build or construction manager at risk may be utilized for complicated projects if the grantee can ensure and document compliance with federal procurement requirements. And just so we're all on the same page, when we talk about complicated projects, we're thinking primarily of treatment plants. If you would like to use an alternative delivery method on a SCIIP-funded project, you should notify your grant manager as soon as possible, and a request should be submitted in writing outlining the rationale and process to be followed. The South Carolina State Engineers Office has a manual that you can find online, and Chapters 11 and 12 contain specific guidance on procurement using alternative delivery methods. The procedures outlined there can be considered as best practices if this route is taken. Federal standards require the use of a competitive request for proposals when procuring an alternative delivery contract. Cost must be a selection factor in that RFP. Construction should not begin on an alternative delivery project until RIA has approved the use of this method and the procurement process. If you've already entered into an alternative delivery contract for a SCIIP project, you should contact your grant manager as soon as possible to discuss. If you're going to use this method, you should expect to be in frequent contact with your grant manager because we'll require detailed updates on the project, particularly the cost, as it progresses. For example, we would expect to review prior to posting an RFP, after receipt of proposals, prior to execution of a design contract, at each stage of the guaranteed maximum price, and again prior to execution of the construction contract. My final topic today is competitive sealed bidding. This is the method used for traditional design bid build construction contracts, and even with federal requirements, it will probably seem pretty familiar. Once design is complete, your engineer prepares the bid package, it's advertised on SCIIP-funded, and bids are opened publicly and tabulated. Then, RIA reviews prior to contract execution. When preparing bid packages for your grant projects, please keep these items in mind. First, because RIA has to review the procurement documents between bid opening and contract execution, the bids must be good for at least 60 days, and 90 would be even better. This gives time for you to obtain the required bonds and for RIA to complete our review after we receive all procurement documents. A few tips on the bid form. It should include all the work that was proposed in the approved grant application. If there's a need to change the scope of the project, you'll need to discuss the possibility of a grant amendment with your grant manager. This is covered in more detail in the grant administration section. Even though we required all applicants to include a 25% contingency in your budget for SCIIP projects, it's still possible that bids may come in over. We've said this many times, but we strongly encourage using bid alternates or breaking the project into divisions to prepare for that possibility. If you take these steps when preparing the bid solicitation, you may be able to proceed with the most important pieces of your project, even if bids come in high. If you don't, you might have to waste time and money rebidding the project due to limits on negotiation. We know that many of you have already thought about how this could be done for your project because you included it in your application narrative. When using alternates, your instructions to bidders should include a detailed description of how those alternates will be selected and how the low bid will be determined. It's okay if some of the work proposed in your application is listed on the bid form as an alternate. If bid prices prevent you from including all the work, you can seek a grant scope amendment at that time. To the extent possible, bid forms should include quantities and itemized costs for the proposed work, and lump sum contingencies must not be included. As you work on your bid package, you should be seeking all necessary permits and acquiring any property, easements, or rights-of-way needed. These must be completed prior to advertisement of the project. When you submit your permit applications to SCDHEC and SCDOT, please be sure to note that they are for a SCIIP-funded project. And finally, don't forget to include all federal terms and conditions. These are included in our project management procedures, and I went over several of them earlier. All grant-funded construction contracts over $100,000, so almost all of them, are also subject to these minimum bonding requirements, which should be included in the bid package. Bidders must submit a bid guarantee for at least 5% of the bid price, and once the winning bidder is chosen, performance and payment bonds for 100% of the contract price must be obtained. RIA also recommends that contractors be required to have hazard insurance. You may have a special condition on your grant requiring review of the bid package prior to advertisement. If you don't, and you don't have any questions about the requirements, you can proceed to advertisement as soon as you get your bid package ready, without RIA review. We do strongly encourage you to advertise bids for construction projects in SCIIP-funded for at least 30 days. It's always a good idea to give your grant manager a heads up when the advertisement goes live. Don't forget to directly solicit qualified firms you know of and document those efforts. You should also consider directly soliciting DBEs at that time. All received bids should be kept secure and unopened until the scheduled public bid opening. If a bidder wishes to correct an error, they may do so in writing prior to opening. Any late bids should be rejected and returned unopened to the bidder. When the bids are tabulated, any errors should be handled as indicated in the bid package. and the bidder must be notified of the error. Discrepancies between unit and total price must be resolved in favor of unit price. Any corrections should be clearly indicated on the Certified Bid tab. The lowest responsive and responsible bidder should be selected for award, using the procedures outlined in the instructions to bidders to handle alternates. If there is any deviation from that, or if any bids are rejected, it should be well documented and explained in the engineer's recommendation to award. In the event that all bids come in over budget, the grantee generally has three options. First, if you can provide the extra funds needed, you can go ahead and award the contract to the low bidder as normal. In this case, we will require you to submit a written commitment for the additional funds prior to executing the contract. Second, you can negotiate with all qualified bidders by requesting a revised bid from all bidders. For those of you who have had RIA grants in the past, this is different from our normal procedures, but it is in line with federal requirements. The third option is to reevaluate your scope of work to reduce project costs and solicit bids again. If costs are significantly over budget, this is the best option. No matter which way you're leaning, please contact your grant manager as soon as possible, and certainly before taking any action if bids are over budget. The last thing I need to say about the competitive bid process is that it should also be used for materials purchases of $250,000 or more. Anytime you're pre-purchasing materials for a grant project, you must ensure that they are stored correctly and separated from other materials your organization owns. The invoices you provide to us for any materials reimbursements should be for the specific items that are then used on the SCIIP project, not to replace ones from your storeroom that you already installed. If you do buy materials in advance, you'll have to wait until construction is underway and the materials are listed on the contractor's pay app to request reimbursement for those purchases. That's all I have on procurement methods. Thanks for your attention to this important topic.